Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on teaching critical thinking in science classrooms. This is a topic that has been of particular interest for me most recently because I've been spending a bit of time in discussions at universities, with Australian curriculum authorities and others. A lot of the time it's the big picture thinking, and sometimes it's really useful to bring it to a classroom of what did it actually look like in a classroom. So that's the intent of this webinar, is to try and make it as practical as possible, the things that you can do in the classroom. So I'm going to start first of all by acknowledging the land of the Ngunnawal people, because that's the lands that I'm talking to you from tonight. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands in which we meet today, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be online with us here today. Strongly encourage you to put the name of the First Nations lands on which you may be on this afternoon or this evening into the chat, please. We like to make sure that our chat is working, and we really want to encourage you to ask questions at all points. I will try and keep up to date with them, but please now I'll give you just 30 seconds to put in the land on which you may be listening tonight. Now, as you do that, tonight's chat is in three parts. I'm going to talk very briefly on what is critical thinking. And it is going to be very brief because there is so much that can be said. And I know that those of you who are interested in doing reading on it, there's plenty out there. But the large part of the talk is going to be, what does critical thinking actually look like in your classroom? What things can you do on a day-to-day basis, not just a one-off big critical thinking project, but the day-to-day critical thinking to embed it into your normal classroom practice. And if I time it well enough, we might have questions and feedback at the end. That's the goal. So just to introduce myself, my name's Helen Silvester. I'm the Learning Area Manager currently at the Australian Academy of Science. I have done some writing for Oxford Science now for Oxford Uni Press for nearly 20 years. There are a number of different editions out there. You will see embedded some examples from the textbook. Now, they're just examples in practice, but I will say this is not a sales pitch. That is very definitely not what I want to do. The key aspect is these are all examples that you can take into the classroom every single day. So we're also recording this so that you may be able to listen back to it later. Okay, so if we're all ready, let's jump right in. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking is one of those cross-curricular capabilities that we all need to embed into our classroom. But part of the challenge is often we don't know when we're doing it. Most of us do it, but we just don't know when we're doing it, and we do need to call it out. It's really important for students to recognise that they're doing critical thinking, and for us to call it out so that they can make it part of their ongoing habit rather than something that stays in the science classroom. So it goes back, critical thinking as a concept goes right back to 1957, was one of the most instrumental papers that were published. And key aspects, identified three key aspects where we want people to pay attention to what's happening around them. So observations and data. So you've got to pay attention, you've got to notice what's happening. Then you've got to ask intelligent questions about it. And there's various definitions of what is intelligent. But also there is a strong element of reflecting and being reasonable when making judgments. And this feeds into some of the later examples of it. And then more recently, critical thinking is purposeful, self-regulatory judgment. And that judgment I'm going to come back to. So results in interpretation, analysis, evaluation, and inference. Now you'll notice that the observation and the noticing has dropped off the front of it, but we've still got the judgment at the end of it. So you need to notice what's going on, you need to question it, but then you also need to make a judgment and take action as a result of it. And they're the common themes that come through. Now, David is one of the people who I've been having a few conversations with. He, until recently, was head of ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Authority, but he talks about transcendental imperatives, being attentive, so again, noticing what's happening. Be intelligent, so ask where does it come from so that you get some understanding of the data and what's happening around. You need to be reasonable when making a judgment, so you need to be aware of the other factors that may be affecting it, and you need to be responsible when deciding how to act upon what you have learned. So in other words, just because we can, should we? Now, these will all sound very familiar to you because we're already doing so much of this in our science classrooms. And it links in with the critical thinking definition that comes from ACARA. In critical thinking is when students learn to recognise, so that observational aspect of it, using evidence in support of an argument, drawing reasoned conclusions, and using that information to act, to take action, to make a judgment, and to do something about it. But just because we can, should we? So we need to bring values into that as well. So you'll notice those common themes, those 4 common themes coming through all the way through. And that ties in to the capability. So the creative and critical thinking capability, where we have inquiring to notice what's happening, to develop questions about what's happening, to identify and process and evaluate information. And then it goes, once you've done your inquiring, you've done your noticing, you're starting to ask questions about that data, then you also need to think up other possibilities. So this is where the creativity partly comes in. So creating alternative explanations, consider alternatives, and to consider possible actions that you can take. So you're generating ideas at this stage. So do your observations, then you generate ideas and possible explanations. Then you analyze the information, and this is the one that we'll spend quite a bit of time on, hopefully tonight. And that involves interpreting, what does this actually mean, to draw conclusions and have evidence to back it up, and to evaluate actions and outcomes. So it's all about thinking about how and analyzing what's appropriate to do, and to have some actions that you're going to check how effective those actions and outcomes will be. And that, of course, goes into reflecting. So all the first 3 things that we talked about is about cognition, so the thinking process. Reflecting is thinking about thinking, the metacognition, so taking the bigger picture, that step back from your own thinking. Once you're aware of what's happening and you've evaluated the effectiveness of your previous thinking and the actions you took, then you can transfer that knowledge to new contexts. So that's a lot to take in. And it's a lot that you'll see that you're probably already doing in your classroom now. But what I wanted to do is actually look at what things can you call out in your classroom that this is part of critical thinking. So yes, that's all very nice. We've got those 4 concepts. That's the history of them. But in the classroom, in the science classroom tomorrow, what could you do? So critical thinking, the best way you can teach critical thinking is mentorship. And this comes from research. Mentorship, where you ask questions and model your thinking out aloud and actually call out, this is what I am doing. So I'm going to think critically about this. I'm going to notice what's happening. I'm going to ask questions about what's happening. I'm going to create possible explanations for it. So calling out that and modeling your thinking out aloud is really important. And please mention to students that I'm going to model my thinking. I'm going to show you what I'm thinking as a way of that you can do in the future. Then there's dialogue. So that's where you can encourage students to ask questions and to ask questions to you and each other. So encouraging that questioning of where's your evidence? How do you think that links to the current ideas that you're doing? So that dialogue, that constant questioning is really important as well. So something as simple as getting students to explain their answers to each other. And so if you've done homework, for example, you could get students to compare their answers and between the pair of them, come up with the best possible answer between them. Because that gets them to analyze what is effective way of answering. What's the question actually asking? What evidence do we have to do it? And therefore, what's the best possible way of answering it? And that way, if you do that as part of a start of the class do now activity, you could potentially then get students more willing to offer answers and discussing why they chose that particular version of it. And that's critical thinking from the very start of the lesson. It's also the most effective critical thinking is relating it to real world situations. So, for example, this is where the science as a human endeavour comes in really effectively because they're the real world situations or real world applications of it. So, try not to say those to just the end of a lesson or the end of a unit of work. Try and have those up front so the students can start questioning right from the very start. So these are the three ways that it's most effective to teach critical thinking. So mentorship, dialogue, and authentic real-world examples. Now you'll see these coming up in some of the everyday examples that I'm going to include shortly. The other thing is that critical thinking needs time and practice. Oh, I'm in the dark. There we go. So critical thinking needs time. In other words, if you ask students a question and you're expecting an answer inside 10, 20 seconds, they're not going to think critically. They'll go in for instinct. So key thing is give students thinking time and call it out as thinking time. Critical thinking is not instinctive answers. It's not rote learning. It is taking the time to observe, to ask questions and create possibilities, to analyze and evaluate, and to also reflect. Now, it doesn't need to be a long time. And as you'll see in some of the examples, it is not something that takes a lot to do. It's not going to take half the lesson. It will only take a couple of minutes. So give students thinking time, just like that previous example I gave you of the do now activity, where students compare their homework answers and identify what is the best possibility. It means they're more likely to offer their solutions later. But it's also, you need to call it out. Students need to practice this. So by choosing something really simple, if you can choose something from tonight's session and use it in tomorrow's lesson, you'll find that it's most effective and you're more likely to remember it. But please call it out for students so that they know that they're practicing and it becomes part of their normal everyday thinking processes. Okay. So let's start going through of all the examples of things that all of these I have done in the past, not as often as I would like to have done it, but if you, again, just make it part of your normal routines. Okay. So let's look at inquiring first. So that first stage, this is about students noticing, identifying, processing, and evaluating the information. So how true is that information? How much evidence is there to back it up? So it's not evaluating an outcome yet, it's evaluating what they see in front of them. So the very first one is start with an activity. So if you're starting a unit or a new particular topic, start with something that provokes questions with students. Now, I've got a really simple one here. This is from Year 7 Forces, where you're just rolling a jar down a ramp. So, and you talk about how would things be different if the jar was covered in different material, if the jar was half full of water, what if the jar was smaller or larger? All of these just get students thinking about the topic that you're going to cover and double checking how much they already know. So there's already starting to think about what they know and what they're thinking. Now, it can be something as simple as this, or if you're marking the role and you need a do now activity, what you can do is you can put a picture up there that provokes questions, or a number of pictures. It may be a quote that provokes questions, and just get students to write down, what does this mean? What questions do you have as part of this quote? You could put up a blog, for example, that might be a bit controversial, and get the students asking about where did that information come from? How accurate is it? That's a really simple thing. A couple of minutes gives you time to mark the role, and then you can use that as the leaping off point for your very next lesson. Sometimes it might be a newspaper article. That's the sort of thing that I've used in the past. But just start with something that provokes questions. You're on the start of critical thinking. Now, if you need a bit of help or the students need some suggestions, because sometimes they don't know where to ask or what sort of questions to ask, they just don't know where to start. I quite like this cue matrix. You can find this online anywhere. But if you start in the top left-hand corner, these are the simplest questions. So these questions are usually yes and no answers. It's a straightforward, fairly closed questions. And when you catch yourself asking too many of these, it's time to start shifting either further to the right or further down. Because if we go down, it's usually a fairly closed question. What did, what can, but if you go, what might happen, what will happen, then that gets students thinking about possible alternatives and what sort of things could happen. So all of a sudden, their thinking is going broader and they're having to do thinking as opposed to the rote answers. The same goes as you move across. So asking how did something happen, how will something happen, how might something happen are much more open questions. And that students have to think before they can provide answers, because it doesn't mean there's an automatic answer. So when you put a provoking picture or quote up there on the board at the beginning of a lesson, put this cue matrix up next to it and encourage students to ask a couple up in this corner. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. And then you could get students to ask a couple down this area here as well. So as soon as they're asking questions, they're starting to engage with the material. And if they're engaging with the material, you're more likely to encourage critical thinking alongside it. So one of the activities you can do tomorrow is start the lesson with a do now activity. Gives you time to get things done, mark the role and everything else, but it also gets students quickly engaged into the topic. Just an example in practice. So this is from the Year 9 textbook, where students are encouraged to do critical thinking, but it gets students thinking about what's a closed question and what's an open question, and developing 3 activities. But in this case, it was about radiation. And they could identify any assumptions or bias that people might have about radiation and cancer therapy. So this is just something in practice, but you don't need the textbook to do this. You can do it yourself. Okay. Now, the other part of the first stage of critical thinking, inquiring, is identifying and evaluating the information. And I really like this process. I think it came from a university in Queensland. I'm not sure what it was, QUT. I've seen it a couple of different ways. I prefer TRAP as the term because it says it is just what it is. I have seen it as crap, where C is again, it was critical time period, I think was the term, the C that they use. But whenever students have evidence, the key thing for them is to ask, when was the document published? Was it published 40 years ago and therefore it's out of date? Is the information relevant? What's the relevance of the information? So is it important or is it not? In other words, don't get caught down that rabbit hole like I did yesterday afternoon. The first A is the authority. So the author, what are their qualifications? Are their qualifications relevant to the field in which it's supposed to be? So what authority do they have, and where did they get their information? So how does the author get their information from relevant sources? Do they include references? How do we know that that author is accurate? There's an awful lot of researchers that have won Nobel Prizes in one field and are very offer a lot of information about a completely unrelated field that is not always accurate. But also students need to be aware of, where did they publish the information? So why did they publish the information rather? So are they biased? Are they just trying to get everyone to believe the same thing they believe? Or is it actually a considered opinion that is trying to inform people as opposed to just being very biased and increasing the level of bias? So be aware of being caught in the trap. So an example in practice, for example, is evaluating claims. So this is from the Year 10 book, using sunscreen. So this was just a blog that I found. I won't identify where the blog came from in detail, but you can see it leads students through the different aspects of the trap method in one form or another, and using that to evaluate the validity of the claim made by the author. So you can find the equivalent blogs anywhere. So that was the first part of critical thinking. Let's look at the next part of critical thinking, generating. So this is creativity, and creativity and critical thinking have been deliberately put together because you can't really have one without the other. Science is wonderful in its creativity. Science have to come up with all sorts of possibilities that they then think critically about. But also you need to come up with alternative explanations to anything. And you need to be able to put your ideas and plan into action. So you need to be able to plan your experiments, for example. That involves both creativity and critical thinking. And I like to think of this, the generating, as the what ifs. And what ifs is something that I always used to use in my classroom all the time. What if? What if the world actually was flat? How will we look for evidence that it wasn't? So all of those aspects, and really good scientists are always testing for alternatives for their particular hypothesis. So what they want to do is try and disprove their hypothesis, because if they can disprove it, that's easier sometimes than to find enough evidence to make it a theory. So one of the examples I've taken from Year 7 is that when they're looking at separating mixtures, for example, you often talk about sand and salt and bits of metal. Separating that in a lab is really easy. But what if we're on a desert island and you didn't have access to lab equipment? Then students have to think about, well, what am I trying to do by using this equipment? So it's deeper thought than just I'm going to use filter paper to filter it. They actually have to think about the purpose of filtering. And that's a lot deeper thinking. And when they're on a desert island, they have to find alternative ways of doing it. So just asking what if, it can be really powerful for students. Another one is when we're looking at, I used to use this for genetics. So you may have seen this for Year 10 genetics, where you have a bowl of lollies or anything else, but lollies was always the big hit. They couldn't, of course, eat them because it was in a science lab. But if they were picking up different types of lollies using different equipment, and I would have different benches being different islands with some equipment on one and other equipment on the others, and see which lollies were eaten up the most and which ones were left behind. And doing that the first time, you're emphasizing one particular set of principles. But if you do it again and talk about, well, if on this particular bench with these lollies, what if we had more spoons? What would be the impact? So all of a sudden, the students moving from let's just collect some lollies to thinking about how and why they got the results they did. So all of a sudden, by considering possibilities and considering alternatives, they're starting to think rather than just be instinctive, this was the answer last time. What if the straws were the only utensils available? Or what type of lolly could the straw be used for? So which animal was more likely to get food in that way? So we're talking about evolution in this case. So by doing something more than once and asking what if, changing something, students are transferring their knowledge, but they're also thinking of alternatives and going back to those core principles. We want to engage their cognition. We want them to think, and that's the whole point of critical thinking. So types of questions you can ask, and I'd often keep the list of questions on my front desk to remind me every now and then, is what happens if you look at this from another point of view? So if you took someone else's point of view, say the point of view of the animal on the island in the evolution example, how would that change things? Is there another way to approach this task? Remember, we're trying to create possibilities. What else could cause this to happen? Could we come up with an alternative? Going back to that flat Earth example, what else could cause the pitches of the Earth if the Earth was shaped like a coin? Was one of the key things that I used to come back to with Flat Earth Association. Be creative and let's identify alternative explanations. What could you do if your first plan didn't work? All of those are things that you can actually ask in your classroom. Just keep the list in your notebook or in your planner or something along those lines, and just make it easier for you to remember and incorporate it into your daily routines. Okay, so we're halfway there. We've gone from noticing to generating, and now we're going to analyze different aspects. And there's 3 parts to this analyzing. The first one is interpreting concepts and problems. The second is drawing conclusions and providing reasons, and we're going to get into argumentation here. And then we're going to go into evaluate actions and outcomes, and I'm actually going to compare analysing and evaluating because they're 2 different things. And I know when I first was started teaching with these particular key words, it made it really difficult to explain to students what the difference is. So I've narrowed that down for you. So when we're interpreting concepts and problems, I like to use the but why. Some of you may have seen this before. It's often used in design thinking. So it may be, for example, forces in year 7. Again, I've included that example. Why are some swimsuits banned in the Olympics? What causes the problems? The swimsuits give athletes an unfair advantage. And the students would get so sick of me saying, but why? So why do the athletes have an unfair advantage? And this is where the science concepts come in. Swimsuits reduce friction in the water. But why? Well, the material helps the water flow along the swimsuit more easily. But why? Why is that a problem? Only competitors from rich countries can afford the material. But why? This makes the competition unfair. So there's lots of different pathways this can go down. And what's really useful is the students get down to, usually if you're asking this around a science concept, they get down to those core concepts, which is this third one here. The material in the swimsuit allows the water to flow more easily, so it doesn't get that turbulence as much. So try using the but why technique just to get students to explain where that evidence has come from. Another one I used to use, but how do you know? Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence was the one that I used to use the most. At one point, I had the whole school yelling out at me, show me the evidence. Okay. Examples in practice. Again, this is just one from the year sevens. This is talking about, again, fairness, responsibility, and respect, and identifying arguments for the use of technology and arguments against the use of technology. It doesn't have to be swimsuits. It can be anything, and it's particularly good when talking about sports and the use of things in sports. It can also be for technology. So if you're talking about advanced technology in, for example, homeostasis, then the cost of that particular technologies. I've also used it when talking about CAR T cells, which cost $300,000 to $400,000 per treatment, compared to how many other people might end up with diabetes. So asking students to be able to identify what the problems are is really powerful. Now, something that I really quite like is argumentation, and I've been spending quite a bit of time on this recently in my day job. So I use Post-it notes, and Post-it notes are really powerful because when you ask students to make a claim about something, they'll say it and then they'll say, and you'll ask, well, show me the evidence, and they'll tell you the evidence, but they don't always link the evidence to the claim. And that's where reasoning comes into it. So the reasoning needs to link the evidence to the claim. So let's have a look at an example. So the claim is Taylor Swift is the most popular singer in the world. And the evidence is she's the most streamed artist on Spotify. So I tend to get them to write the claim and the evidence first, and then get them to write the reasoning. So they've now got to link Spotify to the most popular singer. And their reasoning is Spotify is the most popular streaming service, and therefore more people will listen to her music. Now, for year 7 and year 8, you can just stop at this level. But as students become more capable, you can point out the assumption. So the assumption that they have is that Spotify has the most monthly active users in the world, and they have more than all the other streaming services combined. That's the assumption they have, because students know Spotify, and therefore they assume that it's the only one or that it's the most popular one. So then you say, well, if that assumption is wrong, can you provide some further evidence to back up your original evidence? And to back it up, Spotify has 31.7%. Yes, it's the most popular. Apple has 12.6%. Amazon has 11.1%. All of them have Taylor Swift as the most played artist. I checked this, believe it or not, on the weekend. The only one that doesn't is Tencent, which is played in a lot of Asian countries. They have 14% of the listeners, and they have a separate artist, Zhao Shen, I think is the way it's pronounced, and that's their top played artist. So when you're doing argumentation with students, get the first 3 going and get students used to that, and then start bringing in assumptions and then answering by providing extra backing. Let's look at a science example. Oh, and actually, this is the other thing. It's very useful in critical thinking to compare examples of faulty thinking. So to get students to identify why it's faulty thinking. So global warming is not real, and that's because the Earth has warmed and cooled several times over the last 800,000 years. That's actually correct. Their reasoning is that this is just part of, the current global warming is part of the normal cycle. But the assumption they have made in this claim reasoning evidence is that the current global warming event is the same as previous ones. And the way you would answer that is previous warming events were caused by cyclic changes in the Earth orbits that usually happened over thousands of years, that it would change. It'd go from 180 parts per million up to 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide levels, and the temperatures would change as a result. This event, though, has occurred in the last 50 years, and instead of going only as high as 300 parts per million, it's up to 425 parts per million. So it's 50% more than any other previous event. So these are the sorts of things that getting students to think a little bit broader. So let's look at a science example now. Genetic testing is the one that I've chosen. So the claim is genetic testing is a good thing because you can test for cystic fibrosis, which means the child can be treated and live a normal life. And to link that between genetic testing can identify diseases before they impact negatively a person's life. The assumption is that genetic testing is affordable for everyone. So it's not just a special test. And you also need to back it up that there's no discrimination as a result. So some people might say, yes, it's a bad thing because people might be discriminated against, but Australian law prevents discrimination on the basis of disability. I will say the exception to that is not health insurance, but all the other insurances can discriminate. So that's a bigger discussion, but gives a hint of my biology background. So analysing, I said you need to evaluate the actions and outcomes, the third part of analysing. And this is where I said I would compare the difference between analyse and evaluate. If you analyse something, first of all, you're describing it, whether it's one thing or two things. You might compare it. So if it's two things, you will compare the two. And then you'll describe the pros and cons. So if you're analysing, that's as far as you need to go. Whereas if you're evaluating, you're describing it, you're comparing usually two things or comparing it against criteria, and then you have to make a decision. Does it meet those criteria or does it not meet that criteria? Because you're making a judgment call. So analysing, you stop at describing the pros and cons. Evaluating, you need to make a decision, which means you need criteria for that decision. And when you're justifying, you're explaining your evaluation. So if you're not quite sure how much depth students need to go into, this is a really good guide. I found that it works really effectively. And also you can get students to understand. So if you put this up in front of students, they understand where they need to make how far they need to go in their explanations. So I found this really powerful in the past. So it allows you to make the judgment calls. So let's look at an example. So evaluating the ethics of cheating in sports. I keep coming back to this year 7. So choosing one of these examples, students needed to evaluate. And what I tend to do is justify your decision. So they need to evaluate and justify, and then break it down into the smaller steps. So describing the advantages, describing the disadvantages, describing whether they have equal access. So that becomes the criteria, and whether it would be described as cheating. So breaking it down intentionally for students can be really powerful for them to learn and identify what's actually meant and what level of critical thinking they need. The other thing that is sometimes worth doing is by providing that scaffolding in the first question and then having a second question afterwards where they need to justify as well, but you've left out the scaffolding this time. It makes them realise and go back to the first question and actually make those comparisons. And that's where the critical thinking comes in, is what does it actually mean? And justifying. So bringing in that explaining and describing is really important. Okay, we're getting to the last section of reflecting. So we've done a lot of the cognition aspects where the students are actually doing the thinking. Now we want to think about the metacognition. We want them to think about their thinking and to transfer their knowledge. So key thing is, too often, and I will admit I've done this as well, that when you want students to reflect, please don't just do it before a test. it can happen all the way through. And one of the effective ways of doing it is to think about alternative perspectives and views. So, for example, something like mining is the classic example when you're talking about the rock cycle and mining, but thinking about it from different groups in the community's point of view. So, mining resources, food production, housing, conservation of native plants and animals. Anytime you do ecosystems, you can do the same thing from the point of view we have a housing shortage versus we want to save our animals versus we need farmers want to grow food. It doesn't matter what it is, you can apply and think about multiple perspectives. And as soon as students are thinking about it, they're switching from their current thinking process, this is what I think, to what does someone else think? And all of a sudden, that's the metacognition. So if you can understand how other people are thinking and might think differently to you, then you're actually aware of your own thinking processes. So when you have, for example, when we were talking about at the very start of a lesson having a provocative quote or something at the start of a lesson, think about it from different people's point of view, and you can initiate it at the start rather than just tacked on at the end of a teaching sequence or a unit. Now, again, this is where these two aspects come into the argumentation. So thinking about your thinking is when you're identifying assumptions and when you're able to answer someone else's argument, so you're thinking about how they might try and argue back to you, then it becomes something that they're already thinking about their thinking, they're thinking how other people are thinking. That's the metacognition that we want to include. Questions that you can use. So again, just keep it up the front of the classroom or in your book or something along those lines, just as a reminder to do it as much as anything else. But when students give an answer to a question, you ask, can you explain why you think that? Can you explain how you came to that conclusion? Now, I'm sure some of you have used that question before. And you can give yourselves a big tick because you're actually incorporating metacognition thinking. Who might think differently from you? So you get someone to perhaps be able to argue. They might not necessarily, might agree with one of the other students, but you ask, okay, who might think differently? How might they be thinking? Asking for ideas or other sources, how other people have influenced how you solve a problem. So if someone changes their opinion, ask them what made them change their opinion. The other thing that I found really useful is getting students who are very strong on an idea to think about what information would you need to change your mind. So this is a really difficult one for students. Often used to use it for the highly able students who were very sure of it, but just getting them thinking about what would it take for you to change your view. And that's really powerful, particularly for students who have strong opinions on something they might have come across in social media. So getting them to identify what evidence would they need, and that's I've used that to great effect in the past. And also just getting them to think of a real world situation where something might apply. So that's starting to get into transfer knowledge. So transferring the knowledge is those real world situations. This one's just taken from the Year 10 textbook of Earth and Space Science. So looking at alternative approaches or alternative ways to think about things and to research it as well. So this one's usually comes at the end of a unit of work where it might be a project or something else that students might be applying it. That is critical thinking. So when you're incorporating that into your unit, you're incorporating critical thinking in. So just a reminder, those four aspects of critical thinking, critical and creative thinking that comes from Akara, to recognize when something's in front of you, so to actually notice it and to ask questions about it and to find evidence, look for traps, then to use evidence to support of that argument. So using argumentation to support that argument, draw reasoned conclusions, so analyze and evaluate, but then also to transfer that information, use information to solve problems. And this is one of my favorite quotes from Desmond Tutu. My father used to say, don't raise your voice, improve your argument. And I think that should be on the wall of every science classroom. I think it's really, really powerful. Okay, so we're now at the stage, and I have got some time left to answer questions. So I'm just going to scoot down in the questions. Okay. Currency, Catherine, when I was talking about the trap method. So instead of the T, the C was currency of the information as opposed to time appropriate. Okay, this is time for everyone to ask me questions. I haven't got any questions so far. Does anyone have any? Please feel free to type them in for me. I'm looking for them, but the goal was for tonight for you to have a number of different things you can take into the classroom tomorrow, whether it's some of those questions that you can ask, so those example questions, whether it's something that you just might be able to use, or just the way you start the lesson, start with something with to provoke students, to get them thinking at the very start, and to ask questions and teach them how to ask questions, because students don't know how to do that. Often it's, I don't know how to do this, I can't do this. So get them to turn it into a question and give them that cue matrix as well. We want our students to be articulate. Okay, I'm going to scroll down and see if I've got any more questions. Okay, I've got from Lachlan, am I able to simplify and apply these concepts in a primary classroom? Yes, is the answer to that. So the claim, evidence and reasoning is something you can definitely use in the classroom. Primary Connections makes use of argumentation that way. They use that quite effectively. So yes, you can make use of that in the classroom. You can also get students starting to role play different people's views. So to pretend to be someone else and think about what it's going to be like for them in that situation. Of course, it has to be age and stage appropriate, but all of those are techniques that you can use in different forms. Just simplify them down. You might be talking about year 3 heat, for example, in the primary classroom, and students are studying heat, and you get them to apply it to a new context, so they transfer the knowledge and think about a playground that might be too hot, what sort of materials are used, and get them to design a better classroom. So all of those aspects you can apply just as effectively in the primary as well as the secondary. Simone has said, who decides the criteria when evaluating? That varies, to be honest. If you've got students who don't have any experience, do it with them, decide what criteria. So you need to identify a number of criteria. And then the second step of that, please make time to work out what's the most important criteria and what's the least important criteria, because the priorities of the criteria will change the way you make a decision as well. Not every criteria is going to be equal. So yes, please, with students, you step in and provide that scaffolding for the first time. And then the next time that you do it, maybe you'll get them to decide criteria and you might guide them in priorities. It's also useful when you're thinking about priorities to think it from different people's point of views. So you might have one person might have priorities in a different order to someone else. So think mining, for example. The farmers will have different priorities to people who want the minerals from the mines. You might have the wildlife officers might have different priorities. So again, that brings in that alternative thinking approach. So gradually remove the scaffolding once students are more comfortable. First time students do critical thinking, it's hard. They will find it hard. So provide that scaffolding, model your own thinking in front of them, and have those conversations, get that dialogue going as well. Kate has asked, How do you engage students who are really reluctant to think, like really, really reluctant? Yes. Yes, been there, had those classes as well. I find it tends to be catching in a classroom. So there are different aspects. So again, model your own thinking. Get students to do it in groups. I found I had one class at one point that just refused to ask questions, refused to engage in class in general, let alone anything else. So, what I did is I divided the class into four, and I put a cup in front of every group of students, and I had counters at the front. And every time they asked a question or offered a suggestion or contributed to anything in the class, I'd give them a counter. And I would turn it into a mini competition for less homework, perhaps. So I started out with the four groups in a large class, and that got the competition. And they would always, I'd give them thinking time to compare who was their questions. So I'd say, right, it's a chance to ask a question or offer an alternative. They'd get a counter if they got it right. Didn't matter if it was a right or wrong answer. It was just they gave it. And then over a whole term, I made the groups smaller and smaller. So in the end, I went down from four groups to six groups to eight groups, and then eventually down to groups of three, then pairs, and then individual students. And that got them a bit more confident of talking in the classroom. It took forever. It did take at least a whole term, but it worked for that group of students. So sometimes it's just showing a way that you value every contribution to the class. It doesn't matter what it is. That was just one technique that worked for me in the past. So yeah, good luck. It's not easy, but persist. It takes time. Okay, Leslie, how does AI interface with this? Good question. There are a lot of things, and I know we teachers are starting to use AI as well. Not saying not to use it, but to apply it. So putting in those really awkward questions and then get the students to identify what claim is being made here by the AI, what evidence are they providing to back it up, and do they actually link? So bringing that argumentation into it. I'll be honest, I used AI to come up with some of those argumentation examples. And sometimes it didn't give me a bad example when I was looking for a bad example. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but getting students to apply the process of argumentation to AI is really, really powerful. So AI is a tool like anything else, like a calculator, like a dictionary, anything like that. It is a tool. I don't trust it to get information, but it is really powerful to introduce the importance of being able to use argumentation and to be able to use critical thinking. So if you can provide some bad examples along with some good examples and use that as a comparison as AI, but yeah, it's not perfect yet. I haven't worked out all the ways. I'm still playing with it myself. Brianna has asked, how do you introduce the Q matrix to students? They will look at all the questions and go, too hard. Good question. Start in the top left-hand corner. In the top left-hand corner, get them to ask one question using that very top what example, and get them to ask one question of that, or get it, if you've got a group that's reluctant to do thinking, get them in a group and get them to work their way down all of one row, or to work across one row or work down one column. So start small, build it up over a term so they get used to it, and get them thinking about how the questions are becoming more complex. So using the same topic, asking essentially what appears like the same question, but using those different starters, and it gets them thinking about the types of questions that they need to ask. So that's the way I have done it in the past, but it is really powerful. Start small, start simple, and build it up over a whole term. I've got some thank yous and a few more thank yous. Samantha asking, we're teaching Year 7 about organelles, thinking about putting up a complex picture of a cell and putting up inquiry question matrix. Any suggestions? I would go get them to pick an organelle. And again, like I was just saying, start in that top left-hand corner and get them to ask the questions, either going across or going down, questions just about that one organelle. And you'll find that the thinking will get deeper as they go, but it would start small. So only get them to ask 3 questions and state it has to be across the row or it has to go down the column to start with. Once they get more experience, say, right, ask 1 that is 2 that are simple and 2 that are more complex, and point out which parts of the Q matrix that's useful for. So give that a go. Let me know how it goes. I'll be interested, but that's the way I've approached it in the past. Catherine has said alternative viewpoints is a tricky thing when the answer is clearly right or wrong. Often use 2 truths and a lie. Oh, I like that. That's a really good one. So use 2 truths and a lie to probe these types of questions. So any approaches you'd recommend for this type of content, i.e. naming ionic compounds? I'd get them to work out, put some compounds up there and work out why wouldn't they be ionic. So that gets them down to the basic of what is an ionic compound and why would it not be. Something else would not be. And that will allow for that in-depth explanation. So sometimes the alternative, why is it not? So like the 2 truths and a lie, sometimes one of the examples I've used before is putting 3 completely different pictures or views or different things up there and say, how are they the same? How are those pictures the same? How are they different? So for example, using 2 ionic compounds and 1 covalent compound and say which one's different and why is it different? Which ones are the same and why are they the same? So using that point of view, that's your provocation to start with, and that allows them to get into that questions and alternative viewpoints. So same and different can be equivalent to alternative viewpoints as well. So yeah, try putting 3 pictures up, looking at what's the same and what's different. Samantha has said that thinking about the organelles and the mitochondria being the most important organelle in the cell. I've used that before. Different things that I've used for organelles is I've had students write a job description for an organelle. So thinking about it from how would you attract and identify the key properties of it. I've had a debate over which organelle is the most important and which one isn't. And then having voting at the end where students had to vote for an organelle other than theirs. All of those aspects can come into it, and thinking about being creative. As teachers, we need to be creative as well, but it's encouraging students to think about the claim that it is that organelle is the most important. What evidence have they got to back it up? And the debate is the reasoning that goes in between the two. So thank you for those people who have had to disappear so quickly. And a couple of little ones. How do you discuss controversial topics such as disease control and immunity in grade 9? Again, the different views, but go the argumentation. Argumentation is really effective, and also go for the trap method and getting students to question themselves and being open. So it's not saying that things are right or wrong, but being open and looking for the evidence, and the reasoning that links the evidence to the claim is the most effective ones. I'm running out of time. We've got 1 minute left, so I will say at this stage, thank you everyone for making time. For a lot of you, I know it is dinner time. There are some QR codes up here that you can look at. The Oxford Science. Oxford are supporting this webinar tonight. Also looking for new topics. If you want new topics for us to find some experts to talk on, and I'm not saying I'm an expert, I'm a practitioner, but anything more you need, please just let us know. But thank you everyone for making time at what can be a very busy time for you. So I'll say good night and look forward to catching up with some of you soon.